Well, good afternoon from beautiful sunny here right outside of DC here in Northern Virginia. My name is Eric Missick from Bear Analytics. I'm joined by Joe Colangelo, who's the co-founder and CEO. Joe, say hi to everybody.
How you doing, everybody?
All right, so thanks everybody for joining us for our Event Insight series, which is our webinar series that we do on a weekly basis here on Wednesdays most weeks. We'll keep you updated on the schedule as we get to the end of today's webinar, but we're really excited about the subject matter today, which is the 6 most important event benchmarks for 2022. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to put them in the question box. We'll get through them throughout. We want to keep it as a lively discussion, so I'll be interjecting as Joe's going through the discussion today and shoot those questions his way, and we'll get those answered right away. So in terms of the topic today, benchmarking, it's really one of the most top things that we hear from the market when we're talking to clients. And frankly, we think it's because it's one of the most important things that they need right now is really to understand, well, where does our growth come from? And it's really important to look back on your event trends over time to figure out, well, where am I growing to? How do I get those goals in place? And now, as event organizers are looking for ways in 2022, going back to live, to better understand, well, where's that growth coming from, and where's that both from a revenue standpoint as well as a attendee standpoint, as well as exhibitors and sponsorship revenue and sales. But with benchmarks, it's important to understand that really the ability for benchmarks to provide context is really the most important thing. Right, to get to how are we doing against the result. So it could be all about growth, it could be about marketing, it could be about sales, it could be about tactics. So whether it's good or bad, it's really about how are we benchmarking towards a result. And so today we're going to talk about that, the context, but then also the top 6 important benchmarks as we talk about in the title of what they are, most importantly, how do we calculate them, and what do they actually inform us as we're going through our event cycle. Also, we'll point out that we're offering complimentary consultations post the webinar. So if you want to get set up with benchmarking for your events using one of these top 6, we're happy to jump on the phone with you, walk your team through it, and to better understand where you can focus these benchmarks for your specific event. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joe. He's going to walk us through the 6 most important benchmarks for 2022 events. Joe, take it away.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. Appreciate the intro. Just want to reiterate 2 things that Eric said. Please feel free to use the chat, the question box. We definitely like to hear from you. And if you haven't heard already, this is where we actually get our future webinar ideas from and have really engaging conversations afterwards. So why event benchmarks? The second piece that Eric said I think is huge. So benchmarks are a great way of providing context. And when we often hear, well, what is a benchmark? Well, a benchmark is anything that you're measuring, or like Eric said, against anything that's a result. So it could be something like a favorite that we hear about all the time. It's how are we doing relative to budget? How are we doing relative to last year? Last time we were in this city. How are we doing relative to this XYZ industry standard? So on and so forth. And so the reason I want to just start here, and we have a lot to cover today, so I'll be very brief. Showing one of these slides from Apple, which of course, they're notorious for distilling things down that are unbelievably complex and making them very simple. Is benchmarks also allow you to unlock what I'm calling number 4 there, these hidden truths. And when you see the 6 that we have outlined, a lot of them are kind of canaries in the coal mine for how well various operational and executional aspects of your events are going. And so when we take a look at the M1 chip, when you think about it, you're looking at your new laptop computer. It feels faster. How much faster? Well, it's really impossible to understand that as just a native user. Most of us aren't hardware engineers that are running spec tests on this unless we have a benchmark against the competition. In this case, what a regular 16-core desktop PC can do. And so that's what we're going to uncover today as we walk through these 6 benchmarks. And you're going to see a lot of them are extremely topically focused, kicking right off with number 1, organizational or company audience retention. And so this benchmark may read something like you see there, and all these slides are going to have the same format so that we can maintain consistency and understand how to dissect these benchmarks. So something like 78% of organizations were retained from last year to this year. Really simple in context. This one's a little tricky because the hardest thing is just getting the data to a point where you can clean it up. So if you have a large event or you have multiple events, just making sure that you have some kind of fuzzy logic or data cleaning in place so that you can get down to who that unique organization is. But once you get down to that, calculating this metric is really simple. It's did we see person, or in this case, organization A on list 1, and then did they navigate toward list 2, or this year's registration exhibit sponsorship list. The bigger thing is what's going on here. This is, I think, qualifies as one of these hidden metrics that are massively important, especially for this year. We've all heard about the Great Resignation, people leaving their jobs, moving to other organizations. We're in a very dynamic data environment at the individual level right now. So understanding organizational performance year over year or event over event is extremely critical, because we can't rely on the fact that Tim or Sally or Sue always comes to said event or is always the purchaser of exhibit space at these events. We need to look at it at a B2B level as well. And I know some of you are already doing this in certain ways. I think on the exhibitor front and the sponsor front, we tend to see this kind of being a little bit more of the standard. But on the audience side, on the attendee side, this is really critical. Not only does it give you your retention rate from the exhibitor, from the organizational standpoint, but you also get a sense of what that organizational commitment is. And that's going to be in the magnitude. Are we starting to see more, less, or the same amount of registrants per organization? The other opportunity that it unlocks is organizational communication is a great one-to-many sale. So if you do start to see organizations not participating, it's really easy to do dedicated messaging or relationship building and saying, hey, look, we noticed you weren't in this year. Let's talk about how we can get a group package. This is just some of the things that we've seen our clients do. Let's talk about how we can outline a specific group package because we want you back in some capacity. Understanding it may look different than it did in the past. And again, another strong bellwether as we start to see not every organization coming back to travel when it comes to live events. They have an understanding on which ones may not be participating this year, and then focusing on future event campaigns or future areas to deliver value, whether it's content or otherwise. Okay. Again, the real challenge around this one is just getting the data clean. But once the data gets clean, the utility is pretty high, and it's really not challenging to actually calculate it. Moving over to first-time acquisition rate, our second metric. So something like this may read, as you see there, 55% of your audience is going to be new to your, and I have a couple of slashes because depending on how you want to calculate first-timers, we're kind of rolling up 3 metrics in one. Most folks do it on an event basis, so I want to know how many registrants I've never seen before, but then you're also going to be able to take this logic and extend it out. So I may want to see how many people are new to my entire list, my entire universe, not just events. If we have a publication, if we have a membership list, if we have a giant CRM, if we just acquired a huge list, are these people that I haven't seen anywhere? Very similar to the first one because it's an identity-based metric. Ton of value here. Really easy to calculate once the data is in the right spot. That might be the only hiccup area. And so we've outlined a couple of different ways that we've seen this done across our client base. Some folks just do a really, the most simple method. We're just going to use unique ID. We're going to say that that's email address. Others may have single sign-on, some kind of membership ID, where you're actually pegging that ID. If you have a unified data environment, that ends up going from a moderate method to advanced. Most of the time, though, we still see that there's still some gaps in all of the prospect data being centralized. So we're calling it moderate here for this discussion. And then on the advanced side, doing some things like we've talked about, where you're either using third-party data validation or you're doing some kind of more advanced fuzzy matching, and you're truly knowing who that unique individual is, and maybe even being able to map them as they move roles and move jobs and things like that. What it informs is massive. This is one of my, if I can play favorites, this is one of my favorite metrics, because when it comes to audience acquisition, this one really starts to speak to not just reach, but how effective conversion is. So you're able to start to see folks that we've never gotten to participate in an event are coming in, and then post-event, this is a really, really lucrative group to start to better understand from a persona standpoint. Who did we acquire from the first time? And then I would say the level B to this metric is combining kind of metric 1 and metric 2 and saying, are these also from first-time organizations, or what we call new on new? So again, massively informative, and can be a proxy for event campaign success, especially as you start to see your first-timer metric year over year, or event over event, I should say. All right, moving on to the other side of the aisle, so to speak, looking at exhibitor churn. So obviously, there's a big push right now for live events, return to revenue, and this is kind of, let's call it 3 metrics rolled into one. But looking at an exhibitor by exhibitor level and saying, what does their spend look like? We can do this from strictly a square footage standpoint. I'd recommend that you start there, and then you can do the next level, making it a little bit more complex and adding in the sponsorship spend. So it's perhaps revenue per square footage, per square foot, or total revenue. But just to get things kicked off easy, what percentage of our total number of exhibitors have increased their footprint? Which percentage have decreased? Which percentage has stayed the same? And now when you look at this year over year, you can really start to understand, and I would say this is our probably number one bellwether metric, aligning value on the exhibit floor to the lifetime value of an exhibitor. So in other words, if you start to see, for example, your reductions, your total exhibitor counts outpace your those that are growing their footprint, or you start to see that group that's in the same shrinking in lieu of square footage jettisoning the exhibit hall, that's oftentimes and almost nearly 100% of the time going to be a real long-term challenge between either audience alignment with the exhibitor or value. You might have a little bit of a pricing problem there. Again, once you're able to accomplish this one, it's really easy then to layer in the sponsorship piece. I will say, if we think about 2022, that's also an area we're finding more and more clients are trying to hone insight in from, because a lot of exhibitors are repositioning some of that square footage spend and moving it into sponsorships, especially on the digital side of things. So you may actually be in a scenario where, like the example is here, you're starting to see some reduction, but when you compare it to a benchmark that's taking in either total spend or sponsorship spend, it's going to normalize a little bit more. And that's just really a change in your exhibitor and client and customer behavior. So again, this one also speaks to organizational commitment. We tend to see this change as we move different geographies, especially for different industries that have a large, geographical or are largely influenced by where events take place geographically. And it can also be a broader indication of different subsectors or different sub-industries that you serve, weakness in those particular areas, or strength, to be frank. Okay, we're going to spend a little bit of time on this one because
we got a question that came through.
Let's go.
We want to handle it right away. So question is, do you have any tools or processes recommendations or process recommendations for the fuzzy matching third-party data validation?
Yeah, great question. So soft plug here, our BearIQ platform does that. This is one of the reasons we actually created the company, because we couldn't organize all of our, back when Eric and I worked in an association, we couldn't organize all of our data and get it cleaned up the right way. We quickly got beyond the spreadsheet. However, the good news is, that was like almost 10 years ago. Tech has moved quite a bit since then. So there's some basic Excel formulas that you can use if you're familiar with, SQL or some database stuff, Python. You can get some Upwork folks to help you out with that in in a very quick manner, or brute force. For example, if your data set is small enough, maybe you have events that are in the hundreds of people, just lining up the company names and creating that lookup table manually. It might be the best hour that you end up spending just cleaning that data up. If you have a 100,000 person trade show, it's going to be a little bit of a different exercise. But if you have 3-4 events that are high level, boutique, CEO, C-suite, getting to know one another and a high level of retention, I think you'll find that you can get pretty far by removing duplicates and creating your own lookup in Excel.
Awesome. Hopefully that answers that question. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, and please follow up to that question if it didn't. This is great. Okay, so moving on to our fourth metric. This one is particularly timely right now because I'm sure all of you are experiencing some version of this where audience acquisition, registration conversion is happening closer to the event or later than ever. We thought in 2017 it was a challenge. It got a little bit harder in 2018. It got a little bit harder in 2019. And then, of course, due to the pandemic, through virtual, now back to hybrid or live, it's a completely different ballgame. And so that doesn't mean that your impression window has to be shrunk down from a marketing standpoint. But the hard data that you're going to see on conversions, I'd be hard pressed to see anyone who has seen it expand. Certainly in all the cases that we've seen for Q1 and now starting Q2 events, they're later than ever. So let's actually start to put benchmarks around that. And so what does this look like? Well, most folks are used to tracking registrants on a daily or certainly a weekly basis. You're going to have that timestamp of when people are actually converting, averaging that up to get a sense on where the middle point is, comparing that to history or other similar events in your portfolio is the first place to start. Secondly, you want to get a little bit more advanced. Again, the calculations on this, not the friendliest, but the utility is pretty good. And the reason for that is if you create a window of when do we start to see 25% of our registrants, when do we start to see 75% of our registrants, in other words, what's that middle ground where half the folks come in, that's going to give you a real good sense on when you're going to have to be your most agile from a marketing, a messaging, and a communication standpoint. And if you know that that's the window that you have from a conversion standpoint, I think it lets you, some of our folks have gotten excited because it lets them plan leading into that window a little bit more strategically. It also means that when you are in that window, you don't want to be thinking about things like, oh, I wasn't sure we were going to actually run this campaign this week. There's a little bit more planning that can go in so that you're just updating messaging. Maybe you're A/B testing some messaging during that time, and you can be a little bit more agile, as I've referenced. The complexity here, it really just depends on, is the data in a format where you can turn time series information into days and weeks out. Once you've cracked that nut, the rest is really downhill on this metric. And I think if we polled the audience here, I'd be willing to bet that you're probably already 30-40% of the way there by looking at this data on a days out or a weeks out basis. So this isn't something that's foreign to the majority of the audience that's on the call here.
That might help us with our next question, Joe. It sounds like you may have answered it already, but in terms of, are your clients or are you seeing people look at benchmarks on a daily, weekly, or only post-event?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So let me answer it kind of in reverse. Everyone's looking at something post-event, and they're going to have a number of different benchmarks, whether it's NPS score, whether it's total registrants, how did that compete, total square footage, total revenue, how did we beat budget, whatever your benchmark is, everybody's doing something post-event. In terms of the frequency kind of leading in, we're starting to see that, I would say, compared to pre-pandemic, the frequency has definitely increased. Now, I don't know if you're 15 weeks out from the event, if you're actually looking at it on a daily basis, but if we're looking at our log data, you're starting to see the frequency move up, i.e. when you're like a month out, 2 weeks out from the event, we're starting to see people come in many times per day to see how the data is updating and make decisions to pivot like things like I was just talking about on the marketing standpoint. So it's a good question. I would say the direct answer to it is going to depend on, what metric and where you are in the event cycle.
Okay, makes sense. Appreciate you answering that one as well.
Yeah, no, keep them coming. Really appreciate it. Thanks to the audience. Okay, freshman to sophomore conversion. So this is kind of a moniker that we made up, but it sticks in people's minds when we say it, so we're going to go with it. What this basically means is when you're looking at whether it's an individual's first event or the first year that they registered and attended, are they actually coming back to that following experience? Again, if it's we'll just pretend it's an annual event. Are they coming back that next year? So the number one thing that I just want to highlight for this metric is this number is going to feel abysmally low. If it's somewhere, like you see there, 9%, 12%, that's going to be probably the range that you're going to be operating in. If you have an event that requires like professional training and someone's entering into the industry or that profession, you can expect those numbers to be higher. But the reality here is this is a really, really fundamentally critical metric to starting a registrant or attendee on the pathway to having a high long-term value and being a long-term loyalist. And so it's really critical. Obviously, they can't be a long-term loyalist if you can't get them back kind of the following year. If your event has a heavy rotational cycle, you may want to actually alter this to be the next year that they're in the same geography. We've done that as well. So there's a couple of ways that you can kind of tweak this one. Again, it's a little challenging at the beginning, but if you can get to that first timer metric that we calculated earlier, this one is, again, it's flowing downhill. And I can tell you, if you move this number from 9% to 12%, that's going to be the difference between having an event that's down or near flat to having a growing event, because these gains compound year in and year out. And it's also a great proxy to the value that new folks and potentially new people in the industry or the profession are seeing in your event.
Joe, we had another few questions come in as you
Go.
were talking about this. So about, let's see, the person's asking about, is there a high retention rate? As you noted previously, there's a high retention rate by organization. How about within 2 years? Is the question. I'm assuming that 2 years of when they attended.
So I'm gonna assume that means kind of across, instead of just year to year, but looking across the next 2 years. So if I have that correct, there's a couple of things that can influence that. Again, I refer back to if you have, like, let's pretend you have in the U.S. event and it's a bi-coastal event and you have kind of an East Coast and a West Coast here, you may want to not just look at year-over-year organizational retention, but geography over geography, and treat those even and odd number years as basically being sequential. And so you'd have a direct year-over-year retention rate, and then you would basically have a sequence East Coast and a West Coast year-over-year retention rate. Again, benchmarks are great when you look at them across over time to provide that context. So there's really no wrong way of doing it. It just means that you're looking at things a different way, and you just need to make sure that you understand exactly what's going into those calculations and how they are in fact different.
Okay, awesome. Hopefully that answers that question. If you have need more clarity, just shoot another question out there, and we'll get Joe on it here. He's firing away.
We're firing away today. You got it. Okay. Last one. Absolutely one of the most critical and salient metrics right now, again, is we're in a very return to revenue mindset, and we are seeing, I guess, if I'm making blanket statements across the board, a shift of how exhibitors are transitioning some money from direct square footage into the actual sponsorship realm. So this one's called sponsor revenue. And again, you could pick, usually the uniform kind of example is per 100 square feet, or your average kind of 10 by 10. So just what is that number? This one's great because it's green across the board. Easy to calculate, massively informative, and not very complex at all. So take your total sponsorship revenue, divide it by your exhibitor square footage footprint. You can also then maybe do it to the entire show hall. We've seen people do it, kind of both ways. Usually it's not one or the other. In almost all cases, they'll look at both to be informative. And this is great for understanding if there's going to be different behavioral changes. So are we talking about new money coming in? Are we talking about a shift in our clients' behavior? And then this also speaks, as you heard me reference on some of the earlier exhibitor growth or contraction slide. What is actually your sponsorship opportunity? So kind of not just making it about exhibitor square footage revenue, which is what we covered kind of in the previous metric. And when you combine those two, you're really getting into the corporate willingness to spend. So you really have your revenue with these two metrics and kind of these sub metrics underneath it. You really have good line of sight as to what your revenue opportunity looks like go forward. Okay. Anything else on the question front, Eric?
Let's see, I'm checking through. I think that's it. Someone asked about, are we sharing the recording? And we will be sharing the recording post-event. So you'll get that in your inbox once we get it uploaded and sent out. So don't worry about that. We'll make sure that's out to everybody.
And we really appreciate you joining us today. We talked about metrics. We got 3 killer interviews lined up. So we like to sandwich things this way. We talk about, some of the hard math and how we get things done. And then folks say, well, how are people putting it in practice? Our next 2 webinars with Paul and Chris are folks that have taken, I would say, metrics to the extreme on their audience acquisition fronts. So don't miss those 2 discussions. And then if you don't know Rachel Rimberly, she's the guru in terms of what does the events industry look like, not just here in the US, not just in the EU, but internationally. Crazy line of sight to different trends across different geographies. I'm really looking forward to that one. So we hope to see you again.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Joe. We look forward to seeing you again next week with Paul Kissen. That's going to be an awesome presentation and interview. He's doing it all with a team of 5, and he's going to share all his tips and tricks and what he's doing from a data perspective and how they've seen super success with their event with the Suites and Snacks Expo. So again, thanks for joining us for the webinar today. Any questions you have post-webinar, feel free to shoot us an email, hello@Bear Analytics, but someone will also be following up with you with both the link to today's webinar recording, and also if you'd like to take advantage of our complimentary consultations regarding getting benchmarking set up for your events. We'd love to talk to you. All right. Well, thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good rest of your evening or rest of your afternoon, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.
See you. Bye.